September 1970. 3 days before Jimi Hendrix died in a London hotel room, he stood backstage at a small club in Greenwich Village, talking to an 18-year-old guitarist from the Bronx who had no idea he was receiving advice that would shape his entire career. The kid's name was Paul Daniel Frehley, and he was nobody, just another long-haired teenager with a cheap guitar and impossible dreams. But Jimi saw something in him that night, something in the way the kid held his instrument, something in his eyes that suggested he understood what it meant to communicate through 6 strings instead of words. And what Jimi told him in those 10 minutes, the specific words he chose, would remain hidden for 50 years, locked away in Ace Frehley's memory like a secret too precious to share. Until a 2020 podcast interview when Ace, loose and nostalgic and finally willing to excavate the ghosts of his past, revealed what the greatest guitarist who ever lived had said to a nobody from the Bronx. And those words explained everything about why Ace Frehley became Space Ace, why he hid behind silver makeup for a decade, and why he always played like he had something to prove. But to understand why Jimi's words carried such weight, why they became the foundation for everything Ace would build, you have to go back to who these two people were in September 1970. Subscribe to the channel for untold stories from rock's golden age, the moments that shaped legends, the encounters that changed everything, the words that were never supposed to be forgotten. Jimi Hendrix in September 1970 was 27 years old and dying, though he didn't know it yet. He'd revolutionized rock guitar, had played Woodstock, had changed the way an entire generation thought about what 6 strings and an amplifier could do. But he was also exhausted, burnt out from constant touring and recording and the pressures of being Jimi Hendrix. He'd been spending more time in New York that summer, away from the circus of his London scene, playing small clubs under assumed names, jamming with musicians nobody had ever heard of, trying to remember why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. The megastardom had become a cage, and in those final weeks of his life, Jimi was desperately trying to find a way back to something pure, something authentic, something that felt like music instead of product. Paul Daniel Frehley in September 1970 was 18 years old and nobody. He'd grown up in the Bronx, had taught himself guitar by listening to records and watching other players, had developed a style that mixed blues and rock in ways that felt natural to him, but that he couldn't quite articulate. He wasn't in a famous band. He didn't have a record deal. He was just a kid who hung around the New York music scene, playing in basement clubs for $20 a night when he was lucky, sleeping on friends' couches, living on pizza and ambition. He had talent. People who saw him play recognized that. But talent wasn't enough in New York in 1970. The city was full of talented guitarists, and most of them would disappear into obscurity, teaching lessons or joining wedding bands or giving up entirely. The club where they met was called The Scene, a legendary dive on West 46th Street that had hosted everyone from Hendrix to Led Zeppelin to Janis Joplin during its brief but influential existence. It was one of those places where musicians went after their official gigs, where the real playing happened between midnight and dawn, where you might walk in on any given night and find Eric Clapton jamming with some unknown harmonica player or Johnny Winter trading licks with a session guitarist nobody outside the studio knew. The Scene operated on the principle that talent was democratic, that it didn't matter if you were famous or unknown as long as you could play. And on that September night in 1970, Ace Frehley was there because a friend had told him Jimi Hendrix might show up, and Ace wanted to see his hero play up close. What happened that night has been documented in fragments over the years. Musicians who were there have mentioned it in interviews. People who worked at the scene have talked about it. But the specific details of what Jimi said to Ace remained unknown until Ace himself finally told the full story. The basic facts are these. Jimi did show up that night, around 1 in the morning, with a couple of people from his management team. He wasn't planning to play, was just there to watch, to soak up some music without the pressure of being Jimi Hendrix. But the house band that night was struggling, couldn't find a groove, and the club owner, recognizing Jimi in the crowd, asked if he'd sit in for a few songs. Jimi, being Jimi, said yes. Ace was standing near the stage when Jimi plugged in, close enough to watch his hands, to see exactly what he was doing on the fretboard. For the next 45 minutes, Ace watched a master at work, watched Jimi take standard blues progressions and transform them into something otherworldly, watched him coax sounds from a Stratocaster that seemed physically impossible. Ace later said in interviews that watching Jimi play that night was simultaneously the most inspiring and most depressing experience of his young life. Inspiring because it showed him what was possible. Depressing because it made him realize how far he had to go. When Jimi finished playing and unplugged, he walked past Ace toward the backstage area, and this is where accounts differ slightly, where the story becomes fuzzy in the historical record. Some people who were there that night say Ace approached Jimi and asked him something about his guitar technique. Others say Jimi noticed Ace staring and initiated the conversation himself. But everyone agrees on what happened next. Jimi and Ace talked for about 10 minutes in a dim hallway backstage, and whatever Jimi said had a profound impact on the young guitarist from the Bronx. For 50 years, Ace Frehley kept the details of that conversation to himself. He'd mention in interviews that he'd met Jimi Hendrix shortly before Hendrix died, would say things like, "He gave me some advice that really stuck with me," but he never elaborated. Never explained what advice, never quoted specific words, never provided the details that would have satisfied the curiosity of journalists and fans. It became one of those tantalizing footnotes in rock history, confirmed but unexplained, acknowledged but incomplete. People speculated about what Jimi might have said, what wisdom he might have imparted. But without Ace's cooperation, the conversation remained a mystery. Part of Ace's reluctance to share the story came from a superstitious belief that talking about it would somehow diminish its power, would transform a sacred private moment into public property. Musicians, especially guitarists, often have these totemic memories, these encounters with heroes that feel too important to expose to scrutiny. And part of it was simpler. Ace was protecting something precious, a piece of his origin story that belonged only to him. In the years when he was Space Ace, when he was famous and the makeup hid his real face, that memory of being nobody and talking to Jimi Hendrix was a secret connection to who he really was underneath the character. But in 2020, during a podcast interview conducted via video call during the pandemic lockdown, something shifted in Ace's willingness to discuss his past. Maybe it was the isolation making him nostalgic, or maybe it was turning 70 and realizing that some stories need to be told before the people who lived them are gone. The interviewer, a guitar journalist who'd been trying to get Ace on his show for years, asked about Ace's early influences, about who had inspired him to pursue guitar seriously. And Ace, instead of giving his usual rehearsed answers about seeing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan or listening to Led Zeppelin records, paused for a long moment and then said something he'd never said publicly before. "You want to know who really changed everything for me? Jimi Hendrix, and not just his music. What he said to me 3 days before he died." The interviewer, sensing he was on the verge of something significant, immediately followed up, asking what Jimi had said. And Ace, after another long pause where you could see him deciding whether to finally tell this story, began talking about that September night in 1970. He described the scene, described watching Jimi play, described the moment when Jimi walked past him backstage. According to Ace, he was holding his own guitar, a beat-up Les Paul copy he'd bought used for $150. And Jimi noticed it, stopped, and asked Ace if he played. Ace, terrified and starstruck, managed to nod. And then Jimi asked him a question that Ace has said he's thought about almost every day for the last 50 years. Do you play like you, or do you play like me? That question, simple as it sounds, contained worlds of meaning. Jimi wasn't asking about technique or style or whether Ace was good or bad. He was asking something deeper, something about artistic identity and authenticity. Because by September 1970, Jimi Hendrix had become the most imitated guitarist in rock music. Every young player was trying to copy his sound, his style, his stage moves. And Jimi, who'd built his career on being utterly unique, was watching his innovations become clichés, watching his signature moves get diluted by 1,000 imitators. The question he asked Ace was really a warning. Don't be another copy. Don't disappear into imitation. Find your own voice or you'll be nobody. Ace, in that hallway in 1970, didn't have a good answer. He admitted to the podcast interviewer that he stammered something about trying to develop his own style but learning from Jimi's techniques. And that's when Jimi said the words that Ace would carry with him forever. The words that would eventually inspire the Space Ace character. The words that explained why Ace Frehley always seemed to be playing with something to prove. According to Ace's 2020 account, Jimi looked at him very seriously and said, "The best guitarists are the ones nobody can see. They hide behind the music. You let the guitar be the face and you disappear. That's when you're really playing." That statement, "The best guitarists are the ones nobody can see," hit Ace like a revelation. Because Jimi Hendrix, despite his fame and his wild stage presence and his reputation as a showman, was fundamentally making an argument for the primacy of music over personality. He was saying that the guitarist's ego, the desire to be seen and recognized and celebrated as an individual, could actually get in the way of pure musical expression. That the greatest achievement wasn't fame or recognition, but the ability to disappear into the sound, to let the music speak without the interference of personality. For a nobody teenager from the Bronx in 1970, this was a paradoxical message. Ace wanted to be famous, wanted to be recognized, wanted to escape the anonymity of his working-class background. But Jimi was suggesting that real artistry required a kind of self-effacement, a willingness to let the guitar be more important than the person holding it. And the more Ace thought about it in the days and weeks after that encounter, especially after Jimi died and those 10 minutes backstage became impossibly precious, the more he understood what Jimi had meant. It wasn't about literally disappearing or avoiding fame. It was about not letting your ego corrupt the music, not letting the desire for attention override the commitment to authentic expression. Here's where the story becomes even more fascinating, because Ace told the podcast interviewer something nobody had ever heard before. Jimi Hendrix's advice about disappearing behind the music was the direct inspiration for the Space Ace makeup and character. When Kiss was being formed in 1973 and the concept of wearing makeup and creating alter egos was being developed, Ace initially resisted. He wanted to be seen as himself, wanted people to recognize Paul Daniel Frehley, the guitarist. But then he remembered what Jimi had said 3 years earlier. about the best guitarists being the ones nobody can see, about letting the guitar be the face. And suddenly the makeup concept made sense to him in a way it hadn't before. The Space Ace character wasn't about hiding from success or avoiding recognition. It was about creating a barrier between Paul Daniel Frehley the person and the music he wanted to create. The silver makeup, the space theme, the entire theatrical persona, all of it was a way of disappearing as an individual and becoming pure musical presence. When Ace was Space Ace, nobody was looking at Paul Frehley from the Bronx. They were looking at a character, a concept, a theatrical representation of rock guitar heroism. And behind that character, protected by that makeup, Ace felt free to play without the burden of personality, without having to be himself on stage. He could just be a guitarist, letting the music speak. This interpretation of the Space Ace character completely reframes how we understand Ace's time in Kiss. Most accounts portray the makeup as Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley's commercial gimmick, with Ace reluctantly going along because it was required. But if Ace is telling the truth about the Jimi Hendrix conversation, then the makeup was actually Ace's way of honoring the advice from his guitar hero, his way of achieving what Jimi had described. Becoming a guitarist nobody could see, letting the guitar be the face. The irony is that Space Ace made him enormously famous and recognizable, but the fame attached to a character, not to Paul Frehley. And that distinction mattered to him. But there's another layer to this story, one that Ace mentioned almost as an afterthought during that 2020 interview. But that raises fascinating questions about documentation and historical memory. Ace claimed that after talking to Jimi that night, he wrote down everything he could remember of the conversation in a notebook he was keeping at the time. Just a cheap spiral notebook where he jotted down lyrics, ideas, and guitar licks and random thoughts. And according to Ace, those notes about the Jimi conversation were incredibly detailed. Not just the main points, but specific phrases Jimi used, the way he gestured when he talked, the exact feeling of that moment. Ace told the interviewer that he kept that notebook for years, that it was part of his personal archive of pre-fame materials. But sometime in the early 80s, during the chaos of Kiss's peak years and Ace's struggles with addiction, the notebook disappeared. He's never been sure exactly when or how it vanished. Could have been lost during a move. Could have been taken by someone with access to his house. Could have been accidentally thrown away. But the loss of that notebook, with its first-hand contemporaneous account of what Jimi Hendrix said to him, haunted Ace for decades. Because without the written record, the conversation became memory, and memory is unstable, subject to revision and doubt. Did Jimi really say exactly those words? Or had Ace's mind, over 50 years, reshaped the conversation into something more profound than it actually was? The question of verification is where this story gets really interesting, because Ace's account of meeting Jimi is not unique. Several other musicians have claimed they talked to Jimi in his final weeks, and some of those conversations have been documented by people who were present. There's a well-known story about Jimi giving advice to a young musician at a New York club shortly before his death, telling him something about staying true to his own voice. But the details are vague and the musician's identity has been debated. Could that have been Ace? Or was it someone else entirely, and Ace is conflating different memories? The Scene Club closed in 1971, and most of the people who worked there or frequented it are either dead or have scattered to the winds. Finding corroborating witnesses to a casual backstage conversation from September 1970 is virtually impossible. But in the months after Ace's 2020 podcast revelation, some rock journalists tried to verify the story, reaching out to surviving members of Jimmy's management team and other musicians who might have been at the scene that night. The results were inconclusive. Nobody could definitively confirm or deny that the conversation happened as Ace described it, which means we're left with Ace's word, his memory of something that happened when he was 18 years old, over half a century ago. Does that mean the story is false? Not necessarily. Memory is imperfect, but significant emotional events. Meeting your hero, receiving advice that changes your life, tend to be remembered with more accuracy than mundane occurrences. And the specific content of what Ace claims Jimmy said aligns with things we know Jimmy believed and talked about in those final months of his life. Jimmy was increasingly frustrated with fame and with being imitated, was talking in interviews about wanting to strip back his sound and focus on pure musicianship. So philosophically, the advice Ace describes fits with Jimmy's state of mind in September 1970. The reason this story resonates, true or embellished or somewhere in between, is because it provides a missing link in understanding Ace Frehley's career. For decades, Ace has been portrayed as the reluctant star, the guy who wore the makeup because he had to, who played the character because it was commercially necessary. But if the Jimi Hendrix conversation happened, if those words about disappearing behind the music really were said, then Ace's entire approach to being space. Ace was actually an artistic philosophy inherited from the greatest guitarist who ever lived. It reframes Ace's departure from Kiss in 1982 not as running away from success, but as trying to reclaim his actual face, his actual identity, after a decade of disappearing behind the character. It explains why his solo work always felt more personal and less theatrical than his Kiss material. He was trying to find a balance between Jimmy's advice about letting the guitar speak and his own need to be recognized as an individual. It provides a through line from that 18-year-old nobody in a hallway in Greenwich Village to the 69-year-old guitarist reflecting on his legacy in a 2020 pandemic interview. Resolution. The lost becomes found. At the end of that 2020 podcast, the interviewer asked Ace if he'd ever tried to reconstruct what was in that lost notebook, if he'd ever written down his memories of the Jimmy conversation after the original notes disappeared. Ace said he hadn't, that it felt wrong somehow, like trying to recapture something that was meant to stay in the past. But then he paused and said something that suggested maybe telling this story publicly was his way of preserving it after all. "I guess I'm writing it down now," he said. "Just took me 50 years to do it." Whether every word of Ace's account is literally accurate or whether memory has shaped and refined the story over half a century doesn't ultimately matter as much as what the story represents. A young guitarist receiving wisdom from a dying master and carrying that wisdom through decades of fame and failure and reinvention. Jimi Hendrix told Paul Frehley to disappear behind the music, and Paul Frehley spent 10 years as Space Ace doing exactly that. The silver makeup wasn't a disguise. It was a disappearing act. And the guitar was always the face,